May 27th, 1941, 400 miles west of Brest, France. The Bismarck settled deeper into the Atlantic, her hull torn open by torpedoes and shells, her decks awash with seawater and blood. In the forward damage control station, Oberleutnant zur See Hans Riedel stared at reports that made no sense. The British shells had penetrated armour that German engineers promised was impenetrable. 12.6-inch Krupp cemented plates, the finest armour steel Germany could forge, had been pierced like tin. As the battleships list increased and the order came to scuttle, Riedel understood something his superiors had refused to acknowledge. The Bismarck's armour scheme, revolutionary when designed in the early 1930s, was already obsolete, not because British guns had improved beyond expectation, but because naval architecture had evolved in ways Germany's designers had failed to anticipate. And halfway around the world, in the Kure naval arsenal, Japanese engineers were completing a battleship whose armour protection made the Bismarck look like a relic from the previous war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how Germany's most feared battleship became strategically obsolete before firing a shot in anger begins not with naval combat, but with decisions made in drawing rooms and metallurgical laboratories a decade earlier, where engineers on opposite sides of the world pursued radically different philosophies of warship protection. 1934. Kiel, Germany. The naval architects at Deutsche Werke examined blueprints for what would become the Bismarck-class battleships. Germany had been forbidden from building capital ships by the Treaty of Versailles following the First World War. That treaty expired in 1933. Now Germany could build battleships again, and the Kriegsmarine intended to build vessels that would dominate the Atlantic. The design parameters were ambitious. Displacement was around 35,000 tons to comply with Washington Naval Treaty limits, though Germany had no intention of actually honouring that restriction. 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, maximum speed of 30 knots to outrun British battleships while hunting convoys, and armour sufficient to withstand enemy fire while closing to decisive range. The armour scheme designed for Bismarck reflected German naval doctrine developed during the First World War. The turtleback armour system placed the main armour belt at the waterline, extending it upward to protect vital machinery and magazines. Above the belt, lighter armour protected the superstructure. Below the belt, an anti-torpedo bulkhead provided defence against underwater attack. The main armour belt measured 12.6 inches at its thickest point, tapering to 5.9 inches at the ends. The deck, armour ranged from 3.9 inches over vital spaces to 2 inches elsewhere. The barbettes protecting turret mechanisms received 13.8 inches of armour. The turret faces themselves were 14.1 inches thick. On paper, the specifications appeared formidable. 12.6 inches of Krupp cemented armour could theoretically resist 15-inch shells at expected battle ranges. The inclined belt design would cause shells to strike at angles, increasing effective thickness through obliquity. The underwater protection system, with its multiple compartments and liquid-filled cells, should absorb torpedo hits that would sink lesser vessels. German metallurgists had developed Krupp cemented armour to extraordinary hardness levels. The manufacturing process involved adding chromium and nickel to steel, then case-hardening the face through carburization. The resulting plates combined hard outer surfaces to shatter shells with tough backing layers to absorb. Impact energy. The German armour plate was genuinely excellent, perhaps the finest in Europe. But the design philosophy underlying Bismarck's armour scheme contained fundamental flaws that German engineers either failed to recognise or chose to ignore. These flaws stemmed from outdated assumptions about naval combat that would prove catastrophically wrong. German designers assumed battleships would fight at ranges between 15,000 and 20,000 yards. At these distances, shells would strike armour at relatively flat trajectories. The inclined belt would deflect hits effectively. Deck armour needed only to resist shells that had lost energy after penetrating the belt or fragments from near misses. This assumption was wrong. Actual combat ranges in the Second World War frequently exceeded 25,000 yards. At such distances, shells followed plunging trajectories, falling onto decks rather than striking belts. The Bismarck's deck armour, optimized against horizontal trajectories, was inadequate against plunging fire. German designers also assumed that capital ships would primarily fight other capital ships in decisive fleet actions, similar to Jutland in 1916. They designed Bismarck to survive exchanges with enemy battleships while delivering devastating return fire. What they did not adequately consider was aircraft. Aerial torpedoes would strike below the armour belt. Bombs would fall onto decks. The turtleback system provided minimal protection against these threats. The anti-torpedo bulkheads were placed too close to the hull, limiting their effectiveness. The deck armour was simply too thin to resist heavy bombs. Most critically, German designers placed inadequate armour over steering gear and propulsion machinery spaces. The steering compartments, located far aft and vulnerable to torpedo hits, received minimal protection. This decision would directly cause Bismarck's destruction. While German engineers refined their 1910s-era concepts, Japanese naval architects pursued a radically different approach. 1937. Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. Captain Kikuo Fujimoto reviewed the armour specifications for the Yamato-class super battleships. Japan had withdrawn from the Washington Naval Treaty in 1934. Freed from displacement restrictions, Japanese designers could build without limits. The result would be the largest, most heavily armoured battleships ever constructed. The Yamato would displace 65,000 tons standard, nearly double the Bismarck's actual displacement. 9 18.1-inch guns would be mounted in 3 triple turrets, the largest naval rifles ever put to sea, and the armour protection would exceed anything previously attempted. The main armour belt would measure 16.1 inches thick, not 12.6 inches like Bismarck, but 16.1 inches, 40% thicker, and this was not the only difference. The Japanese armour scheme differed fundamentally in philosophy and execution. Japanese designers placed the armour belt well inboard, behind the outer hull plating. This created a void space between the outer hull and the armour. Torpedoes striking the hull would detonate against the outer plating. The explosion would vent into the void space. Then the blast would encounter the massively thick armour belt, which would contain the damage. This system, called the all-or-nothing armour scheme, had been pioneered by the United States Navy but refined by Japan to its ultimate expression. The concept was simple, but radical. Armour the most vital spaces with maximum thickness. Leave less critical areas completely unarmoured. Do not waste weight on moderate protection that might be penetrated anyway. The Yamato's armour belt extended from the forward turret to the aft turret, protecting machinery, magazines, and command spaces. Within this citadel, armour thicknesses exceeded anything on Bismarck. The main belt was 16.1 inches. The deck armour over magazines and machinery measured 7.9 inches on the main armoured deck, with an additional 2.4 inches on the weather deck above. Total deck protection exceeded 10 inches in places. This was not armour designed to resist shell fire at medium ranges. This was armour designed to resist plunging fire at extreme ranges and heavy bombs from high-altitude aircraft. The turret faces received 25.6 inches of armour. The barbettes were 21.5 inches thick. These dimensions were not incremental improvements over Bismarck. They represented a completely different scale of protection. The metallurgy also differed. Japanese VH armour, standing for Vickers, hardened after the British company that developed the original process, used nickel-chrome-molybdenum steel. The manufacturing process created plates with exceptional resistance to penetration. Tests conducted after the war showed Japanese armour plate was qualitatively superior to both German and American armour of equivalent thickness. But thickness mattered more than quality. A 16.1-inch plate was simply harder to penetrate than a 12.6-inch plate, regardless of metallurgical properties. And when Japanese plate quality matched or exceeded German quality, the combination of superior thickness and superior materials created protection that existed in a different category entirely. The underwater protection system also reflected different design priorities. Yamato's anti-torpedo bulkheads were placed much deeper inboard than Bismarck's, creating a wider void space to absorb torpedo explosions. The bulkheads themselves were thicker and backed by additional holding bulkheads. The system incorporated liquid-filled compartments that would absorb blast energy through compression of water. Japanese engineers had studied damage reports from naval battles in the First World War and in the ongoing Sino-Japanese conflict. They understood that torpedoes were becoming larger and more powerful. Aircraft-launched torpedoes could deliver warheads exceeding 800 pounds of high explosive. Such weapons could not be stopped by thin bulkheads placed close to the hull. The Yamato's protection system was designed to survive multiple torpedo hits, not just one or two, but 4, 5, or more torpedoes striking simultaneously. The inboard placement of armor and the depth of the protection system meant the ship could absorb catastrophic damage to outer compartments while maintaining buoyancy and stability. Most importantly, Japanese designers armored the steering gear heavily. The steering compartments on Yamato received armor protection equivalent to the Citadel. Multiple rudders provided redundancy. Even if one rudder was jammed, the ship retained steering capability. This was not theoretical over-engineering. This was the result of Japanese naval officers and engineers asking a fundamental question. German designers had failed to ask, what actually sinks battleships in modern combat? The answer, drawn from analysis of Jutland and subsequent naval actions, was not enemy guns, at least not directly. Battleships were rarely sunk by shellfire penetrating magazines or causing catastrophic explosions. They were sunk by cumulative damage that caused flooding, loss of power, or loss of steering. They were sunk by fires that could not be controlled. They were sunk by torpedoes striking in vulnerable locations. Japanese designers armored against these threats. Extensive compartmentalization limited flooding. Fire suppression systems were installed throughout the ship. Critical systems had multiple backups, and steering gear, the ship's Achilles heel as the Bismarck would prove, received the same protection as magazines. By 1941, when Bismarck sortied into the Atlantic and met her fate, the Yamato was already fitting out at Kure. The two ships represented the culmination of respective nations' battleship design philosophies. One philosophy was grounded in First World War experience and optimized for medium-range gunnery duels. The other philosophy anticipated future warfare dominated by long-range combat, air power, and attrition. The contrast extended beyond armor. Bismarck displaced approximately 50,000 tons fully loaded. Yamato displaced 72,000 tons. Bismarck's main guns fired shells weighing 1,864 pounds. Yamato's guns fired shells weighing 3,200 pounds. Bismarck could steam at 30.8 knots. Yamato managed 27.5 knots, but the Japanese ship did not need to run. She was designed to fight. German naval doctrine emphasized commerce raiding and breaking out into the Atlantic. Bismarck needed speed to evade superior forces and catch convoys. Japanese doctrine emphasized decisive fleet actions. Yamato needed protection and firepower to survive and dominate in the climactic battle for control of the Pacific. These different doctrines produced different ships, and when evaluated purely on protective capabilities, the difference was stark. Bismarck was a fast battleship with good armor for her size. Yamato was a mobile fortress that could barely be sunk by conventional means. The Battle of the Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941, demonstrated the consequences of inadequate armor against modern threats. HMS Hood, a battlecruiser with thin deck armor optimized for earlier eras, exploded when a German shell penetrated her decks and detonated a magazine. Bismarck herself was hit multiple times but remained combat-capable because British shells at that range lacked the velocity to penetrate her belt. But 2 days later, on May 26th, a single torpedo from a Fairey Swordfish biplane struck Bismarck's stern and jammed her rudder. The steering gear, inadequately protected and vulnerable to underwater attack, was wrecked. The battleship could no longer maneuver. She steamed in circles, unable to escape pursuing British forces. The next morning, British battleships caught up. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney opened fire at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. Their shells fell in plunging trajectories onto Bismarck's decks. The 3.9-inch deck armour, sufficient against shells striking horizontally, could not resist 14-inch and 16-inch shells falling vertically with full kinetic energy. Shells penetrated into machinery spaces. Boiler rooms flooded. Electrical systems failed. Fires spread. The armour belt, magnificently resistant to horizontal fire, was bypassed entirely as shells smashed through the decks and detonated inside the hull. After 2 hours of bombardment, Bismarck was a burning wreck. Her guns still fired sporadically, testimony to German engineering quality, but she was doomed. British cruisers closed and fired torpedoes. At least 3 hit. Finally, German crews opened scuttling valves, and the ship sank. Analyses conducted after the war determined that Bismarck's armour belt had not been penetrated by shell fire during the final action. The belt did its job perfectly, but shells had not needed to penetrate the belt. They penetrated the decks instead, striking at the weak point in German armour philosophy. Would Yamato have survived similar treatment? Almost certainly, for longer and perhaps indefinitely. Her deck armour was more than twice as thick as Bismarck's. Shells that smashed through Bismarck's decks would have been stopped or deflected by Yamato's armoured decks. The Japanese battleship was specifically designed to survive exactly the type of plunging fire that destroyed Bismarck. More critically, Yamato would never have been put into a position where she could only steam in circles. The heavily armoured steering gear would have survived torpedo hits. Even if one rudder jammed, the multiple rudder systems provided redundancy. The ship would have retained maneuverability and could have escaped or fought on equal terms. The technological gap between Bismarck's armour and Yamato's armour reflected a broader gap in naval engineering sophistication. Germany had entered the war with a navy designed for the previous war. Japan had entered the war with a navy designed for the war they anticipated fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was not a failure of German metallurgy or manufacturing. The Krupp armour plate was excellent. The problem was strategic and philosophical. German naval leadership had not correctly assessed how naval warfare would evolve. They had not appreciated the importance of aircraft. They were not designed for combat at extreme ranges. They had not protected critical systems adequately. Japanese naval leadership, studying the same historical evidence and conducting the same analyses, reached different conclusions. They anticipated that future battleships would fight at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards, where plunging fire dominated. They anticipated that aircraft with torpedoes and heavy bombs would be primary threats. They designed accordingly. The result was a ship with armour protection so comprehensive that American naval officers examining the wreck after the war expressed professional awe. The Yamato represented the absolute pinnacle of battleship protection. Nothing built before or since matched her armour thickness or sophistication of defensive systems. The irony deepened when considering that Germany and Japan were allies during the war, yet never shared their naval architectural advances. Germany learned nothing from Japanese armour innovations. Japan learned nothing from German Atlantic raiding tactics. Each nation pursued its own path, and those paths diverged dramatically in effectiveness. By 1942, the Bismarck lay on the bottom of the Atlantic, destroyed after a single sortie. The Yamato steamed as the flagship of the combined fleet, her massive armour yet untested in combat. That test would come, but not in the way Japanese planners anticipated. The fundamental question facing battleship designers in the 1930s and 40s was how to distribute limited weight between armour, armament, propulsion, and other systems. Every ton devoted to armour meant one less ton available for guns, engines, or fuel. The designer's art lay in optimization, balancing competing demands to create an effective warship. German designers, working under the assumption that Bismarck would need to reach 35,000 tons standard displacement to comply with treaty limits, allocated weight conservatively. In reality, Bismarck displaced over 41,000 tons standard, but the armour scheme had already been fixed based on lighter displacement assumptions. Even when additional weight became available, it went primarily into propulsion and fuel capacity rather than increased armour. Japanese designers faced no such constraints. The Yamato class was designed from the outset as a treaty-breaking super battleship. Weight could be allocated wherever needed. The result was a ship where armour consumed approximately 33% of total displacement. For comparison, armour represented approximately 28% of Bismarck's displacement. That 5% difference translated to thousands of tons of additional armour plate. The Yamato carried approximately 23,000 tons of armour protection. Bismarck carried approximately 17,500 tons. 6,000 tons more armour meant the difference between adequate protection and comprehensive invulnerability. The distribution of that armour also mattered. Bismarck's armour was spread more evenly across the hull, providing moderate protection to more areas. Yamato's armour was concentrated in the citadel, providing maximum protection to vital spaces while leaving other areas lightly protected or unarmoured. This concentration reflected Japanese confidence in their damage control capabilities. Hits to unarmoured areas would cause flooding and damage, but compartmentalization would limit the effects. As long as the citadel remained intact, the ship could fight. German designers, less confident in damage control or perhaps more concerned about prestige and appearance, armoured more extensively but less heavily. The armour schemes also differed in their approach to underwater protection. Bismarck's anti-torpedo system consisted of a series of compartments extending from the outer hull to the main armour belt. The outermost compartments were empty. The next layer contained oil or water. Behind that came the main armour belt. The system was designed so that torpedo explosions would be absorbed progressively through the layers, with the energy dissipating before reaching the armour belt. In theory, this was sound. In practice, the system had critical weaknesses. The distance from the outer hull to the armour belt measured only about 12 feet. This limited the system's ability to absorb energy from large warheads. Additionally, the armour belt itself was not particularly thick by the standards of underwater protection. 12.6 inches of armour could resist shellfire, but high explosive detonating in contact with the plate could cause spalling on the inner surface, where metal fragments broke loose and caused internal damage. Yamato's system was more sophisticated. The outer hull was designed to rupture and vent the torpedo explosion outward as much as inward. Behind the outer hull lay a void space extending nearly 20 feet inboard. This void was divided into compartments by longitudinal and transverse bulkheads, creating a honeycomb structure that would channel blast energy and prevent progressive flooding. Behind the void space came the main anti-torpedo bulkhead, constructed from thick steel plate backed by additional holding bulkheads. Behind that came the armoured belt, which in Yamato's case was 16.1 inches of hardened steel. Any torpedo warhead powerful enough to breach this system would have to first rupture the outer hull, then blast through multiple void compartments, then penetrate a heavy bulkhead, and finally crack 16.1 inches of armour plate. Post-war analysis by American naval engineers concluded that Yamato's underwater protection system could theoretically withstand torpedo hits containing up to 1,000 pounds of high explosive without suffering critical damage to machinery or magazines. Bismarck's system was rated for perhaps 400 pounds, and even that estimate proved optimistic when the Swordfish torpedo jammed her rudder. The steering gear vulnerability that doomed Bismarck was not unique to that ship. Most battleships of that era placed steering compartments far aft, below the waterline, in positions vulnerable to torpedo attack. The logic was that steering gear needed to be close to the rudder for mechanical efficiency. The rudder had to be at the stern, therefore, steering gear would be at the stern. Japanese designers accepted this mechanical constraint, but armored accordingly. Yamato's steering compartments were protected by armor nearly as thick as the main citadel. The Germans apparently concluded that such heavy armor, so far from the ship's center of buoyancy, would affect trim and stability unacceptably. They chose vulnerability over additional top weight. This decision reflected a broader pattern in Bismarck's design. Compromises were made to achieve speed and preserve stability. Weight was allocated to achieve 30 knots rather than to maximize protection. The resulting ship was fast, well-armed, and adequately armored by First World War standards. By Second World War standards, against aerial torpedoes and plunging shellfire, she was vulnerable. The Yamato, designed without speed constraints and with protection as the primary consideration, made opposite choices. Speed was sacrificed for armor. Stability calculations incorporated the massive weight of the armor scheme from the outset. The result was a ship that was slower, but vastly more survivable. Naval combat in the Pacific would ultimately validate Japanese design priorities, though not in the way anyone anticipated. The decisive fleet action between battleships that Japanese planners envisioned never occurred. Instead, aircraft carriers dominated naval warfare. Battleships became supporting units, providing anti-aircraft fire and shore bombardment rather than fighting other battleships. In this environment, armor mattered primarily as defense against air attack. And against air attack, the difference between Bismarck's armor and Yamato's armor would have been dramatic. American dive bombers in the Pacific carried armor-piercing bombs weighing 1,000 to 2,000 pounds. These weapons, dropped from altitude, could penetrate Bismarck's deck armor relatively easily. They would bounce off Yamato's decks or detonate without penetrating. The Yamato was attacked by aircraft multiple times during the war. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she was hit by 2 bombs. Neither penetrated the armored deck. The damage was superficial. In April 1945, during her final mission, she endured hours of attack by hundreds of American aircraft. Bombs struck her repeatedly, and most either failed to penetrate or caused limited damage because the armor held. What finally sank the Yamato was not bombs but torpedoes, and even then it required extraordinary numbers. American torpedo bombers struck her with at least 10 torpedoes, possibly as many as 13. The underwater protection system, designed to resist multiple hits, performed as intended for the first several impacts. But cumulative damage overwhelmed even Yamato's sophisticated defenses. The ship developed a list as flooding progressed. Counter-flooding to correct the list reduced stability. Eventually, the combination of torpedo damage and counter-flooding caused her to capsize. Even then, the citadel remained intact. The armor was never penetrated by bombs. The ship was sunk by cumulative underwater damage from more torpedoes than any other vessel in history had ever survived. If Bismarck had faced a similar attack, she would have sunk far more quickly. Her thinner deck armor would have been penetrated by bombs. Her less robust underwater protection would have been overwhelmed by fewer torpedoes. Her inadequately protected steering gear would have been disabled early in the attack, leaving her unable to maneuver. The Yamato survived for hours under attack that would have destroyed Bismarck in minutes. This was not speculation. The British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse were sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers in December 1941. Prince of Wales took 6 torpedo hits and sank within hours. Repulse took 5 torpedoes and sank even more quickly. Both ships had armor schemes comparable to Bismarck's in philosophy and thickness. Neither came close to Yamato's protection levels. The lesson was clear. Against modern aerial weapons, incremental improvements in armor were insufficient. Only comprehensive, heavy armor across all axes of attack provided real protection. Yamato had that protection. Bismarck did not. The comparison extended to damage control capabilities. Both ships carried sophisticated fire suppression systems, pumping equipment, and trained damage control parties. But the Yamato's compartmentalization was far more extensive. The ship was divided into over 1,000 watertight compartments, flooding could be isolated with extraordinary precision. Bismarck's compartmentalization was less extensive, and critically, many compartments had poor watertight integrity. During her final battle, flooding spread more rapidly than damage control parties could contain it. Watertight doors that should have held against seawater pressure failed. Electrical systems shorted out as water reached switchgear. The cumulative effect was progressive loss of control. Yamato's designers had anticipated this. Electrical systems were redundant, with isolated backup circuits throughout the ship. Pumping capacity far exceeded theoretical requirements. Damage control parties were stationed throughout the vessel with equipment pre-positioned. The philosophy was that any ship could be damaged, but damage need not be fatal if properly contained. The metallurgical differences between German and Japanese armour also deserves examination. Krupp cemented armour, used on Bismarck, was manufactured by carburizing the face of nickel-chromium steel plates, creating a hard surface layer over a tough backing. The process produced excellent armour resistant to penetration by armour-piercing shells. Japanese VH armour used a different process, starting with nickel-chrome molybdenum steel and using a proprietary heat treatment. The resulting plates had more uniform hardness through their thickness, rather than having a distinct hard face and soft back. This gave Japanese armour better resistance to cracking from high-velocity impacts. Post-war ballistic tests conducted by the United States Naval Technical Mission to Japan compared captured Japanese armour plate to American and German armour of equivalent thickness. The tests showed that Japanese VH armour was approximately 10% more resistant to penetration than German Krupp cemented armour. This was a modest advantage, but combined with the 40% greater thickness of Yamato's main belt, the total protection difference was enormous. A 16.1-inch plate of VH armour was roughly equivalent in protection to an 18-inch plate of Krupp cemented armour. Bismarck's 12.6-inch belt, even if replaced with Japanese armour, would still have been far inferior to Yamato's protection. The turret armour told a similar story. Bismarck's main turrets had 14.1-inch faces. Yamato's turrets had 25.6-inch faces. This was not merely thicker armour. This was armour on a completely different scale. A shell that could penetrate Bismarck's turret face would require nearly twice the energy to penetrate Yamato's turret. The practical implication was that Yamato's turrets were essentially immune to any gun then at sea. American 16-inch guns, the most powerful weapons the United States Navy deployed on battleships, could not penetrate Yamato's turret faces at any realistic combat range. British 15-inch guns certainly could not. German 15-inch guns, firing shells from Bismarck herself, would have bounced off Yamato's turrets like thrown rocks. This level of protection came at costs beyond simple weight. The massive armour plates required specialised manufacturing facilities. The Kure naval arsenal had to construct new furnaces and rolling mills capable of producing plates exceeding 20 inches thick. The forging process took months per plate. Quality control required X-ray examination of every plate to detect internal flaws. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce such armour, even if designers had specified it. German armour plate mills were optimized for plates in the 12 to 14-inch range. Producing 20-inch plates would have required massive capital investment and years of development. Japan made that investment because naval supremacy was existential for an island nation dependent on maritime trade. The strategic implications of this armour gap extended beyond individual ship survivability. Bismarck's vulnerability meant that German battleships could not be risked in extended operations. The loss of Bismarck after a single sortie demonstrated that even the most powerful German warship could be destroyed by forces the Royal Navy could reasonably assemble. Yamato's protection meant that Japanese battleships could be deployed with confidence that they would survive. The psychological impact on enemy forces was substantial. American naval commanders knew that engaging Yamato in surface combat would result in heavy losses, even if ultimately victorious. This knowledge influenced operational planning throughout the Pacific War. German naval strategy, built around commerce, raiding and breakout operations, could not afford to lose capital ships. Each battleship represented years of construction and vast resources. The loss of Bismarck was a strategic disaster from which the Kriegsmarine never recovered. The remaining German battleships spent most of the war in harbour, too valuable to risk but too vulnerable to deploy effectively. Japanese naval strategy accepted that battleships might be lost, but only after inflicting disproportionate damage on enemy forces. Yamato was designed to survive long enough to justify her construction cost through combat effectiveness. Even when she was finally sunk, she had absorbed attacks from more than 300 aircraft and required ordnance expenditure that might have sunk a dozen lesser ships. The question of why Germany did not adopt Japanese armour innovations has multiple answers. First, German and Japanese naval design bureaus did not meaningfully share information despite being allies. Each nation guarded its technical advances jealously. Japan particularly kept Yamato's specifications secret, fearing that knowledge of the super battleship's capabilities might prompt other nations to build counters. Second, even if Germany had known about Yamato's armour scheme, duplicating it would have been nearly impossible. The industrial infrastructure required to forge 20-inch armour plates did not exist in Germany. Building that infrastructure would have taken years and diverted resources from other programs. By the time Germany could have manufactured Yamato-class armour, the war would have been over. Third, German naval doctrine did not prioritize the same characteristics as Japanese doctrine. Germany needed fast ships, capable of raiding commerce in the Atlantic. Heavy armour meant lower speed. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized firepower and protection over speed, because fleet actions in the Pacific would be fought at shorter ranges where speed mattered less than survival and hitting power. Fourth, Germany's strategic position was fundamentally different from Japan's. Germany was a continental power, with land borders to most enemies. The navy was important, but secondary to the army. Japan was an island nation where the navy was the primary service. Resource allocation reflected these priorities. Japan could afford to build the most expensive, most heavily armoured battleships in history. Germany could not make a similar investment. These factors meant that even if German designers had recognized the superiority of Japanese armour philosophy, adopting it was impractical. Bismarck's armour scheme was adequate for German needs, given German constraints. The problem was that German needs and constraints led to a ship that could not survive in modern naval combat. The final irony was that neither Bismarck nor Yamato achieved their strategic objectives. Bismarck was designed to disrupt Atlantic convoys. She sank one battlecruiser and was herself destroyed before sinking a single merchant ship. Her strategic impact was nil beyond the psychological shock of Hood's destruction. Yamato was designed to win the decisive fleet action that would destroy enemy naval power. That action never occurred. She spent most of the war as a floating headquarters and was ultimately expended in a suicide mission against American forces invading Okinawa. Her magnificent armour allowed her to survive hours longer than any other battleship would have, but survival without purpose was meaningless. Both ships represented the pinnacle of their respective nations' battleship design philosophies. One philosophy was adequate. One was exceptional. But both philosophies became obsolete during the war, as aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the capital ships of naval warfare. The age of the armoured battleship ended not because armour became inadequate, but because the platform itself became strategically irrelevant. Yet within that context, the comparison remains instructive. When Bismarck and Yamato are evaluated purely as armoured fighting ships, as mobile fortresses designed to survive and fight, Yamato was superior in every measurable way. Her armour was 40% thicker on the belt, more than twice as thick on the decks, and protected critical systems that were vulnerable on Bismarck. Her underwater protection could withstand hits that would have crippled the German ship. Her damage control capabilities exceeded anything the Germans achieved. The gap was not incremental, it was categorical. Yamato represented a different generation of protection technology, one that Bismarck's designers never achieved and could not have achieved given their constraints. Germany's pride, the mighty Bismarck, was obsolete the day she was launched, not because British ships were better, but because Japanese ships were incomparably superior. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The technical specifications told only part of the story. The true measure of armor effectiveness came not from engineering drawings but from combat experience, and the combat histories of Bismarck and Yamato revealed precisely how the 40% thickness advantage translated into operational reality. May 24, 1941. The Denmark Strait. Bismarck's first and only combat against enemy capital ships lasted 15 minutes. HMS Hood closed to approximately 16,000 yards before German guns opened fire. At this range, shells followed relatively flat trajectories, striking armor belts rather than decks. This was exactly the combat scenario German designers had optimized for. The engagement validated German gunnery excellence. Bismarck's fifth salvo struck Hood, and one shell penetrated the thin deck armor over the aft magazine. The resulting explosion broke the ship's back. Hood sank in less than 3 minutes. But this victory revealed nothing about Bismarck's armor, because Hood barely had an opportunity to return effective fire. The accompanying battleship, HMS Prince of Wales, scored 3 hits on Bismarck before withdrawing. One shell struck below the waterline forward, causing flooding in several compartments. Another hit damaged fuel tanks, causing oil contamination and loss of usable fuel. The third hit was inconsequential. None of these hits penetrated the main armor belt or threatened vital systems directly. However, the flooding from the underwater hit caused Bismarck to trim down by the bow. The fuel contamination reduced her operational radius significantly. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the operation, decided to abort the mission and return to France for repairs. These were not crippling hits, but they were sufficient to compromise the operation. The damage revealed a weakness in Bismarck's underwater compartmentalization. The forward hit flooded not only the immediate compartment, but also several adjacent spaces, because watertight integrity was compromised. German damage control parties worked effectively, but the ship's design did not adequately contain flooding from underwater damage. Would Yamato have suffered similar compromise from equivalent hits? Almost certainly not. Her compartmentalization was far more extensive, with each watertight zone subdivided multiple times. Flooding would have been contained to the immediate impact area. Her fuel tanks were better protected and arranged so that contamination of some tanks would not critically reduce operational range. The real test of Bismarck's armor came 2 days later when British battleships caught up with her after the Swordfish torpedo jammed her rudder. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney opened fire at approximately 24,000 yards. At this range, 14-inch and 16-inch shells followed plunging trajectories, falling onto Bismarck's decks at steep angles. The first salvo from Rodney struck Bismarck's foredeck near the forward turrets. The shells penetrated the deck armor, which measured only 2 to 3.9 inches in most areas. Once through the deck, shells detonated inside the hull, causing fires and destroying interior compartments. Subsequent salvos walked down the length of the ship, each one smashing through the inadequate deck armor. Within 30 minutes, Bismarck's forward turrets were knocked out. Shells had penetrated the barbettes or damaged the turret machinery below deck. The fire control stations were destroyed. The superstructure was ablaze. Shells continued to rain down, and the deck armor could not stop them. The 3.9-inch plates that seemed adequate when designed in the early 1930s were catastrophically insufficient against plunging fire from heavy guns. German accounts from survivors described shells penetrating into boiler rooms and engine spaces. High-pressure steam lines ruptured. Fires spread through ventilation systems. Electrical power failed as generators were knocked offline. The ship was being destroyed from the inside. Her magnificent side armor rendered irrelevant as shells bypassed it entirely by coming through the roof. After approximately 90 minutes, Bismarck was a blazing hulk, dead in the water, her guns mostly silent. British cruisers closed and fired torpedoes. The underwater protection system, already stressed by the Swordfish torpedo 2 days earlier, was overwhelmed. Additional flooding accelerated the end. At 10:39 on May 27th, Bismarck rolled over and sank. Post-war analysis by Robert Ballard's expedition, which located the wreck in 1989, confirmed that the armour belt remained largely intact. The belt had done its job, but the job it was designed to do was not the job required in actual combat. The deck armour had failed catastrophically. The steering gear had been disabled by a single torpedo. The compartmentalization had not prevented progressive flooding. Everything that Yamato's designers had done right, Bismarck's designers had done inadequately or wrong. Contrast this with Yamato's combat experience. The super battleship first came under serious air attack during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 struck the Japanese fleet as it approached the Philippines. Yamato was attacked by dive bombers and torpedo bombers. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers dropped 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs from altitude. These weapons, designed to penetrate battleship decks, struck Yamato's armoured deck and bounced off or detonated without penetrating. The 7.9-inch main armoured deck, backed by additional armour layers totalling over 10 inches, was simply too thick for the bombs to defeat. One bomb did score a hit on the weather deck near the stern, penetrating into crew quarters and causing casualties. But this was an area outside the main citadel where armour was lighter. The bomb did not threaten any vital system. Fires were quickly contained. The damage was superficial from a combat capability standpoint. Torpedo attacks were pressed home with greater determination. American TBF Avenger torpedo bombers carried Mark 13 torpedoes with 600-pound warheads. These weapons, properly fused and dropped at correct altitude and speed, were the most effective aerial torpedoes in the world. 2 torpedoes struck Yamato during the Leyte Gulf engagement. The underwater protection system absorbed both hits. The outer hull ruptured, the void spaces flooded, but the explosions vented outward and dissipated through the honeycomb compartments. The main anti-torpedo bulkhead was held. Behind that, the 16.1-inch armour belt was not even tested. The torpedoes never reached it. Yamato suffered flooding in outer compartments, causing a slight list that was quickly corrected through counterflooding. She maintained full speed, and all weapons remained operational. The damage that would have crippled Bismarck was merely inconvenient to Yamato. The ship continued her mission without significant compromise. The final test came on April 7, 1945. Yamato was dispatched on Operation 10 Go, a suicide mission to beach herself on Okinawa and fight as an unsinkable fortress supporting Japanese defenders. The mission was strategically pointless, but it provided the ultimate test of her armour under sustained attack. American reconnaissance. Aircraft located Yamato's force early on April 7th. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, launched massive strikes. Over 300 aircraft from multiple carriers attacked the Japanese force throughout the afternoon. Yamato became the focus of coordinated bombing and torpedo attacks that no ship had ever been designed to survive. The first wave attacked around 12:30. Dive bombers struck first, their bombs falling on Yamato's decks from high altitude. Most bombs bounced off the armoured deck or detonated without penetrating. Several hits were scored on the superstructure and unarmoured areas, causing fires and casualties among anti-aircraft crews. But the citadel remained intact. Torpedo bombers followed, pressing attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. This was the tactic American pilots had developed specifically for killing heavily armoured Japanese battleships. Attack from both sides simultaneously so that the ship cannot manoeuvre to, present her best protected angles. Overwhelm the defences with numbers. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, shooting down several attackers. But there were too many targets. Torpedoes began hitting. The first 2 or 3 were absorbed by the underwater protection system as designed. Flooding occurred in outer compartments but was contained. The 4th and 5th torpedoes struck in areas already weakened by previous hits. The cumulative damage began to overwhelm the protection system. The sixth torpedo opened flooding to deeper compartments. The seventh caused a serious list. Counter-flooding was ordered, but this reduced stability. More waves of aircraft arrived, more bombs struck, more torpedoes hit. The American attacks were relentless, coordinated, and executed with precision learned through years of Pacific combat. This was not the confused, scattered attacks that Bismarck had faced. This was industrialized destruction, methodically applied. By 2 o'clock, Yamato had absorbed at least 10 torpedo hits and numerous bomb hits. Her list exceeded 15 degrees. Speed had dropped to 18 knots, but her main battery continued firing, her engines still ran, and her citadel remained unpenetrated. The armor was holding even under attacks far beyond anything contemplated in her design. The 11th, 12th, and 13th torpedoes hit in quick succession on the port side. The cumulative flooding, combined with earlier counter-flooding, caused stability to deteriorate catastrophically. The list increased rapidly. At approximately 2:20, the order was given to abandon ship. Yamato rolled over slowly, her massive bulk taking nearly 5 minutes to capsize completely. As she rolled, one of her magazines detonated, creating an explosion visible for miles. The ship sank, taking over 2,300 crew with her. Only 280 survived. But here is the critical point. Even after absorbing more torpedoes and bombs than any other battleship in history had ever survived, Yamato's armor was never actually penetrated in the citadel. American post-action reports noted with professional respect that the Japanese battleship had withstood an incredible pounding. She was sunk by cumulative flooding that overwhelmed her stability, not by direct destruction of magazines or machinery through armor penetration. If Bismarck had faced even a fraction of that attack, she would have sunk within the first 20 minutes. Her thinner deck armor would have been penetrated by bombs early. Her less robust underwater protection would have been overwhelmed by the first 4 or 5 torpedoes. Her steering gear would have been disabled, leaving her unable to maneuver. She would not have lasted 2 hours. The comparison was not hypothetical. The British battleship Prince of Wales, with armor comparable to Bismarck's, was sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers off Malaya in December 1941. She took 6 torpedo hits over approximately 2 hours and sank. Yamato took at least twice that many torpedoes over a similar period and continued fighting until stability failed. The difference was armor. Specifically, the difference was 40% thicker belt armor, more than double the deck armor, vastly superior underwater protection, and comprehensive compartmentalization that Bismarck simply did not have. American naval architects who examined Japanese armor technology after the war wrote detailed reports on Yamato's protection system. These documents, now declassified, reveal professional admiration mixed with relief that the United States had never faced Yamato in surface combat. American 16-inch guns, the most powerful weapons in the U.S. Navy, would have struggled to penetrate Yamato's armor at any realistic combat range. The Bureau of Ships conducted ballistic tests using captured Japanese VH armor plates. 16-inch shells fired at representative combat ranges could not reliably penetrate 16.1-inch VH armor. Some shells penetrated. Most did not. The armor was simply too thick and too well made. Against Bismarck's 12.6-inch belt, American 16-inch guns achieved penetration reliably at ranges under 20,000 yards. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a battleship that could be destroyed by conventional means and a battleship that represented the absolute limit of survivability. The strategic implications were profound. If Germany had possessed battleships with Yamato-class armor, the Royal Navy would have needed fundamentally different tactics to counter them. Surface engagement would have been far more costly. The loss of Hood would have been repeated because British 15-inch guns could not have penetrated such armor at typical combat ranges. But Germany did not possess such battleships and could not have built them. The industrial capacity did not exist. The metallurgical expertise was inadequate. The doctrinal understanding was absent. German designers had created the best battleship they could given their constraints. It was simply not good enough. Japan, facing different strategic requirements and possessing different industrial capabilities, created a fundamentally superior design. The 40% armor advantage was not the result of slightly better engineering. It was the result of a completely different design philosophy, backed by industrial commitment that Germany could not match. This raises the question of whether armor thickness was the decisive factor or whether other design elements contributed equally to survivability. The answer is that armor was necessary, but not sufficient. Yamato's armor made her difficult to sink, but her compartmentalization, damage control systems, and redundant critical systems were equally important. A ship with Yamato's armor, but Bismarck's compartmentalization would still have been vulnerable to progressive flooding. A ship with Yamato's compartmentalization, but Bismarck's armor would have been destroyed by plunging fire. The complete package mattered, and Yamato had the complete package while Bismarck had partial solutions. The human element also differed. Japanese damage control parties were extensively trained and equipped. Every crew member knew damage control procedures. Equipment was pre-positioned throughout the ship. Drills were conducted constantly. When Yamato took damage, damage control responses were immediate and effective. German damage control training was also rigorous, but the procedures were hindered by design limitations. When flooding spread through inadequate watertight subdivisions, even the best damage control parties could not contain it. When shells penetrated thin deck armor and detonated deep inside the hull, fires could not be fought effectively because the armor that should have stopped the shells was not there. The comparison extends to fire control and gunnery systems. Both ships featured advanced optical rangefinders and mechanical fire control computers. Bismarck's systems were excellent, among the best in the world. Yamato's systems were comparable in accuracy but had longer maximum range because her guns outranged any other battleship afloat. In theoretical surface combat between the two ships, Yamato could engage Bismarck at ranges where German guns could not effectively respond. The 18.1-inch guns had a maximum range approaching 42,000 yards. Bismarck's 15-inch guns reached approximately 36,000 yards. Yamato could stand off and bombard Bismarck from outside effective return fire range. Even if Bismarck closed to effective range, her shells would struggle to penetrate Yamato's armor. Meanwhile, Yamato's 3,200-pound shells would smash through Bismarck's armor with devastating effect. The engagement would be one-sided. This was not speculation. Ballistic calculations confirm it absolutely. The crews of both ships were highly trained professionals who performed with courage under extreme circumstances. Bismarck's crew fought their ship with determination even when the battle was clearly lost. Yamato's crew maintained discipline and effectiveness through hours of overwhelming air attack. The human quality was comparable. The material quality was not. This material inequality reflected broader patterns in the Second World War. Germany entered the war with qualitatively superior equipment in many categories, but inadequate industrial capacity to produce it in necessary quantities. Japan entered the war with extremely capable equipment in specific categories, but overall industrial weakness. Both nations faced enemies with superior industrial capacity. In the specific case of battleship armor, Japan had achieved technical superiority over both Germany and initially over the United States. American Iowa-class battleships, contemporary with Yamato, had 12.1-inch belt armor and 6-inch deck armor. This was better than Bismarck but inferior to Yamato. The Iowas compensated with speed and superior fire control, but in pure protection, Yamato was supreme. The United States recognized this after the war. Plans for the Montana-class battleships, which were never built, specified armor protection matching or exceeding Yamato's. The American Navy had learned what the Japanese already knew. Against modern weapons, incremental armor was insufficient. Only comprehensive heavy armor provided real protection. Germany never learned this lesson because Germany never had the opportunity to build second-generation battleships incorporating combat experience. Bismarck was sunk in 1941. Her sister ship, Tirpitz, spent most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords and was eventually sunk by British bombers in November 1944. Neither ship influenced German naval construction because Germany built no more battleships after 1940. Resources that might have built improved battleships went instead to submarines, which were more effective against Allied shipping. This was probably the correct strategic decision. Battleships were becoming obsolete. Submarines and aircraft were the weapons of the future, but it meant Germany never corrected the armour deficiencies that made Bismarck vulnerable. Japan continued building battleships into 1941. Yamato was completed in December 1941. Her sister ship, Musashi, was completed in August 1942. A third ship, Shinano, was converted to an aircraft carrier during construction. Plans for additional super battleships were cancelled as Japan's strategic situation deteriorated and resources became unavailable. Musashi's combat history paralleled Yamato's. She was sunk during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 by sustained air attacks. American aircraft struck her with an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over 4 hours. Like Yamato, she was sunk by cumulative flooding and stability loss, not by direct armour penetration. The punishment both ships absorbed before sinking testified to the effectiveness of their armour schemes. No ship with Bismarck-class armour could have survived even half the damage that Yamato and Musashi absorbed. The comparison was stark and undeniable. 40% thicker armour translated to multiple times greater survivability under realistic combat conditions. The legacy of these design philosophies extended beyond the Second World War. Post-war navies examined the lessons learned and concluded that heavy armour was obsolete. Guided missiles could not be stopped by any practical armour thickness. Future warships would rely on speed, countermeasures, and point defence rather than armour protection. This conclusion was probably correct for guided missile warfare, but it validated the Japanese approach to armour for the era in which Yamato was designed. If battleships were to survive long enough to be made obsolete by missiles, they needed comprehensive heavy armour. Yamato had it, Bismarck did not. Modern naval historians evaluating these ships recognize Yamato as the ultimate expression of battleship design. She represented the limit of what was technically possible using 1940s technology. Every system was pushed to maximum capability. The armour was as thick as could be manufactured. The guns were the largest ever mounted. The displacement was the highest ever achieved. Bismarck, by contrast, represented a compromise design that tried to balance multiple requirements and succeeded at none perfectly. She was fast, but not fast enough to escape determined pursuit. She was well armed, but outgunned by multiple contemporaries. She was adequately armoured for medium-range combat, but vulnerable to plunging fire and torpedoes. The comparison is not intended to diminish German engineering achievement. Bismarck was a formidable warship by the standards of her era. But she was not exceptional. She was not revolutionary. She was a competent execution of dated design philosophy. Yamato was revolutionary, the absolute pinnacle of battleship protection, a ship whose armour made her effectively immune to surface combat defeat. The 40% thicker armour was not merely a number. It was the difference between adequacy and invulnerability. It was the difference between sinking after 90 minutes of surface combat and surviving hours of sustained air attack. It was the difference between being disabled by a single torpedo hit and absorbing 13 torpedoes before succumbing to stability loss. When Bismarck rolled over and sank in the Atlantic in May 1941, she took with her the illusion that Germany could build battleships equal to the best in the world. She could not. The technological gap was real, substantial, and unbridgeable given German industrial constraints. When Yamato sank in April 1945, she took with her the era of the armoured battleship. No navy would ever again build ships with such comprehensive protection. The age of armour had ended, but in that final era, Japan had achieved what no other nation achieved. A battleship with armour so thick, so comprehensive, so sophisticated, that she represented the theoretical limit of survivability. Germany's pride, the Bismarck, was obsolete before she ever fired her guns in anger. Not obsolete because technology had moved beyond battleships, but obsolete because Japan had already built battleships a generation ahead in protection capability. The 40% armor advantage was not marginal, it was categorical. It was the difference between the best Germany could do and the best anyone could do, and Germany's best was simply not good enough.